Yeah, it really is as though our army, rather than being the redcoats patrolling, Fallujah or whatever, shooting and bombing people, that they're all, I guess, fighting in Massachusetts Bay, for Yorktown or something, forcing the redcoats off of our land still. It's like the Revolutionary War never ends, no matter where it really is.
That's very true. And, I was actually watching CNN this morning and last night quickly. And there's two things that really struck me, and this kind of speaks to what we were just talking about. This morning, one of the shows was about hot dog eating. Apparently there's a guy who can eat lots of hot dogs. Some contest about food. And I watched that, and then last night they had something about Obama's dog. Apparently he told his daughter that he was going to buy her a dog. And they had a whole, 5-minute clip on this thing. And I'm just thinking to myself, watching both, that we're in the middle of a constitution and monetary crisis in our country, and the best that the media can do is talk about eating lots of hot dogs and dogs.
Yeah.
I mean, it just really sickens me.
Yep, and you know what's funny? It's been like this. I can't even remember where now, unfortunately. It would have made a good footnote, but some movie about war propaganda that showed that right at the dawn of the Cold War, when they decided that, no, we're not going to scale back the military at the end of World War II, we're going to keep the arms complex going on. The movie Tone News was all about the sneezing contest somewhere in the Midwest, and then and hot dog eating and whatever. It's always been this way, the Britney Spears of the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Everything but what's important.
Which is a very good reason to decentralize education and get the government out of it, because we need it. We need generations of people who can think for themselves and not put up with this crap.
Well, maybe we should just put all the schools under the Department of Homeland Security.
There's actually some interesting play between the Department of Education, Department of Homeland Security, and other government agencies. So I wouldn't put it past them in the near future to start moving more in that direction.
Really? Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, the recruitment efforts, recruiting more folks in the military, the information that they're allowed to gather, that they're gathering from multiple different sources, including gathering the information from the Department of Education. So you have that whole piece of it, too. And then I don't know if you're familiar with the New Freedom Commission on Mental Health.
Oh, yeah. Well, now, we haven't covered that in very much depth here on the show, but I've heard Dr. Paul complain about it.
If you're interested, I would suggest you have Dr. Karen Ephraim, who's kind of the national expert on these type of things. But it's basically collusion between various government agencies, including the Department of Justice. And from what I remember reading, the Department of Defense actually has some kind of role in these efforts, too. And understandably, I just would disagree with it. But, all these government agencies have an interest in gathering as much information on the American citizens, including their mental health, as possible.
And now this is the mandatory mental health screening in the government schools on the little kids, right?
Yeah, we have to be careful on the use of language. Yes. Generally speaking, yes. What they claim is that they're not mandatory and they're not universal. But if you think about any kind of program that would necessitate the need to find, quote-unquote, mental illness in children, if the teacher themselves cannot see abnormal behavior and then determine that there's a problem with that child and then speak to the parents about it, that's like the prime thing that should be done. But if in fact it's not being done, then you have to universalize it, because then you're going to say, well, we're going to miss someone. Because obviously someone's going to fall through the cracks because the teacher doesn't see something. So you actually have to have it universal. And at this time, it's not mandatory in all these districts and schools, but, any program run by the government or private-public partnerships ends up being mandatory.
Right, yeah, especially the latter there. Well, especially both, I guess. And now this is something else that you brought up, and that was the debt crisis and the dollar crisis, which I guess those things are tied together there. The national debt, just the national debt right now is over $9 trillion, which is actually, as far as I can tell, an unimaginable amount of money, at least for my limited cranium here. And the declining value of the dollar, our dollar's worth less than the Canadian loonie.
That's a funny name.
Isn't it?
And that leads me to ask some more questions. When you listen to Senator McCain or Senator Obama talk about their various ways of solving these problems, which I have questions about the role of the federal government in solving any of these problems. One thing that they don't address, which I know Congressman Paul addresses a lot, and I know you had Lou Rockwell on recently, and he and the Mises folks address a lot, is the whole Federal Reserve System and our monetary policy, which leads us to be able to fight these wars indefinitely. Well, actually, not indefinitely. Eventually, it's going to come down and crash. but for a long period of time.
Mm-hmm. Well, now explain that. Why is it that central banking is so important to our permanent state of warfare?
I would refer folks to the Mises Institute website, Mises, MISES.org, and LouRockwell.com. They do a much better job than I can do explaining this. And listening to your interview, I know that you're quite familiar with this too. But the fact that the government can print money and doesn't require to come to the American citizens for taxes or to borrow it, allows them to pay for these wars and pay for all these other programs and projects over time. But in fact, by inflating the money supply, they decrease the value of the dollar, and then we get things like $4 or $5 gallon, dollars for a gallon of gas, or whatever we're now paying for bread and milk. And unfortunately, the American people are miseducated and blame such as they blame Exxon, or they blame the Democratic Congress, or they blame whoever they happen to blame at this moment for the increased cost of energy, and they say we'll just dig some more oil wells in the United States and we'll be energy independent, which is actually nonsense, because if we dug more oil in the United States, it would just go on the world market. It's not going to necessarily just stay in this country. As opposed to looking at the true cause, or possibly one of the major causes of the crisis we now find ourselves in, which is the monetary system, which is caused by the Fed. No people really talk about the Fed.
I would say that was a perfectly fine answer.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. The deferral of the cost. Hey, this war's going to be free, everybody, and then they end up paying later, and they don't understand why everything is going up in cost. But that's the price of the war they're paying at the pump there.
Right.
All right, and now number 5 on the list is dead American soldiers. And in fact, I've heard conservatives complain that we've got to get over this idea that our soldiers' lives are important as individuals. And, of course, they always want to have it both ways. Don't get me wrong. But, Iraq, 4,000 casualties, that's nothing. We lost 4,000 in one day at the Battle of whatever the hell in World War II. And that we're too attached, maybe, to the lives of our soldiers. They're soldiers. That's their job to die.
Well, I would say two things. I wonder how people can be pro-life and pro-war. Now, a war of self-defense is one thing, but this type of war in Iraq is definitely not a war of self-defense. And for so-called conservatives who, run around wanting to protect life, how, in fact, can they put our young men and women in harm's way? Obviously, someone dying is just horrible, but then you have all the wounds, people who are wounded, the PTSD, so they're coming back, mentally with lots of mental problems. And as conservatives, our interest should be obviously in the liberty of the individual, but also the family, the strength of the family and the community. And how can you take young men and women and put them in harm's way for years at a time, change their mindsets, they're like in a combat mindset, and then expect them to come back and just act normally within their families and within their communities? It's impossible, and it's very destructive to parents. Parenting with their children is destructive to the relationship with their spouses, with the other members of their family and their community. So that's just one thing that conservatives should think about, how destructive war is to the family. And even a step closer in is just deployment. I mean, even if we weren't in war, the fact that we have, troops in 135 countries, 700 to 800 bases worldwide, that in and of itself is destructive to the family, let alone war, which is, 10 times more destructive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something that people hardly ever talk about because, we have this kind of foolish division in our society, it seems to me, where at least in general, if you're a liberal, you're against war, and if you're conservative, you're for it. And yet this cuts to the very core of conservatism, is the importance of at least the nuclear family, if not the extended family here in the United States, is the basis of our society. And that war, this biggest of big government programs, is the most disruptive of family life, even worse than the worst sort of welfare programs.
Right. And another piece of this, too, and I happen not to be a Christian, I happen to be Jewish, but there seems to be a lot of interest within the so-called conservative Christian community in support of a war. And I would suggest that they need to go back and actually see and read what Jesus said, because I thought he was the Prince of Peace and would be mostly opposed to any and all wars. I think they need to go check their premises about that, too.
Yeah. We talked about the torture at the Bagram Air Base there, the movie Torture Taxi and stuff like that, where a lot of these guys, the sleep deprivation, the method for the sleep deprivation in a lot of cases is they chain them to the ceiling, but where they basically have to keep at least one leg stiff under them. If they give slack to both knees, then they either pull their arms out of their sockets, break their arms, and or it contorts the rib cage so that they can't breathe. It suffocates them. And when we were talking about that on the show a few weeks back, somebody commented on the blog, that's called crucifixion. That's what they did. That's the whole point of the nails through the feet and all that, is you have to put pressure on the nails in your feet in order to breathe. And this is what the Roman Empire did to Jesus Christ, and this is what we do. This is what the American government does to people in our salt pit torture dungeon over there in Afghanistan.